A man in a gray jacket sits down on a bench in Griffith Park in Los Angeles, next to a man he has never met, who is crying. Not quietly. Not the kind of crying a person can manage in public without being noticed. The other kind. The man in the gray jacket does not look away. He does not take out his phone. He does not say, "Excuse me," and find another bench, of which there are several. He sits down. He turns slightly toward the man. He says nothing. For a long time, he says nothing. What he does instead, for the better part of 2 hours on a Tuesday morning in October, is the thing that most of us are not trained for, and that most of us, if we are honest, would not have done. He stays. Nobody in the park recognized him that morning. Not the two women walking a terrier on the path nearby, not the older man feeding pigeons at the far end of the plaza. Not the park maintenance worker who passed twice with a cart full of leaf bags and glanced over and saw only two men on a bench in the early light. Nobody knew who the man in the gray jacket was. The man beside him didn't know either. Not for the first hour and 40 minutes. What happened in the last 20 minutes? What was said? What was given? And what a 58-year-old veteran named Dennis Marr carried away from a bench in Griffith Park and has been carrying ever since, is a story about the specific thing that presence costs and what it returns. There is a stretch of Griffith Park in Los Angeles, just east of the Greek Theater, where the paths widen into a small plaza and the city drops away behind the tree line, and the mornings are quieter than you would expect from a park inside one of the largest cities in America. A ring of concrete benches surrounds a low fountain that runs from April through November. Pigeons. Squirrels that have developed opinions about tourists. The particular quality of light in Los Angeles in October, which is different from the light in every other month, and that people who have lived there a long time can identify without being able to explain. The benches fill up slowly in the mornings. Runners pass without stopping. Dog walkers stop to let the dogs sort out their relationship with the fountain. By 9 o'clock on most days, a loose collection of people have settled in. People with nowhere to be, or people who are between places, or people who have chosen this bench on this morning because being outside felt more manageable than being inside. Dennis Marr had been coming to this plaza for 7 weeks, not every morning, most mornings. He had found it the way people find the places they return to, not by deciding to, but by arriving there one day and understanding that it was where he needed to be, and then coming back. He was 58 years old. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Silver Lake, 14 minutes from the park, that he had rented for 3 years after the divorce. He had 2 adult children, a son in Sacramento and a daughter in Phoenix who called on Sundays and holidays and sometimes on ordinary Tuesdays for reasons he had stopped being able to predict, which was one of the things he loved most about them. He had a dog, a 7-year-old shepherd mix named Bale, who had a bad hip and moved slowly on cold mornings and slept on the left side of the bed with the specific conviction of an animal who has decided the arrangement is permanent. He had served in the Army for 22 years. He had been deployed 3 times, twice to Iraq, once to Afghanistan. He had come home from the 3rd deployment in 2009, and coming home had been its own kind of experience, which he had not fully understood until several years later, when the understanding arrived in the form of a depression so specific in its texture and so resistant to the usual remedies that he had eventually found himself in a therapist's office in Atwater Village at the age of 53. Telling a woman named Dr. Claire Whitfield things he had not told anyone, some of which he had not fully told himself. The therapy helped. It helped in the specific way that things help when they do not solve the problem, but change your relationship to it. When you stop waiting for the weight to disappear and begin instead to learn the shape of it, so that you can carry it differently. He had been doing that for 5 years. He was better than he had been. He was not, on the Tuesday morning in October, when a man in a gray jacket sat down beside him, on a bench in Griffith Park, entirely all right. He had not been planning to cry. He had not been planning anything. Exactly. He had driven to the park because it was a Tuesday, and Bale needed walking, and the apartment had been feeling, in the preceding 48 hours, like a space he needed to leave, without knowing where to go. He had walked Bale along the path, and then sat on the bench nearest the fountain, and watched the light come through the trees. And Bale had put his head on Dennis's knee, and that was apparently the thing that was needed to open something that Dennis had been keeping closed for 6 weeks, since the call from his son that had told him that a man named Raymond Culver, Sergeant Raymond Culver, 22nd Infantry Regiment, the man Dennis had served beside for 11 years and trusted with his life in the specific way you trust a person when your life is what is at stake, had died in a hospital in Colorado Springs at the age of 61, from causes that were the long tail of things that happened in other places a long time ago. He had not gone to the service. He had not been sure he could. He had told his son he would go, and then the day had come, and he had not gotten in the car, and he had not called to explain, because he did not have an explanation that he could say out loud without it falling apart. He had been carrying that for 6 weeks, alongside the grief itself, and the compound weight of the two things together was what he had been managing, imperfectly, when Bale put his head on his knee and the bench in Griffith Park received what he had been managing. He was not aware, for some time, that anyone had sat down beside him. The man in the gray jacket had been in the park since 7:15. He came here when he was in Los Angeles, and the morning was right, and he did not have to be anywhere until later. Not always. When the conditions were right, the light, the quiet, the specific quality of a morning that felt like it belonged to whoever was willing to be in it, he drove to Griffith Park and walked the eastern paths and occasionally sat at the bench by the fountain and drank coffee from a travel mug and watched the park do what parks do in the morning. He had arrived before Dennis. He had been sitting at the far end of the same bench, not the near end, 3 feet of distance, which was the normal distance between two strangers on a public bench, and communicated nothing except ordinary consideration. He had watched Dennis arrive with the shepherd mix on the leash, and sit down and look at the fountain and do nothing in particular, and had thought nothing particular about any of this. He had watched the dog put its head on the man's knee. He had watched what happened after that. He had not looked away. He had not reached for his phone. He had not assessed whether this was his business, because the assessment took approximately 2 seconds, and the answer was that a person was in pain on a bench 3 feet away, and that was sufficient. He set his coffee down. He did not move closer. He did not speak. He simply turned slightly toward the man, enough to communicate that he was there and not pretending not to be, and waited. After a while, 4 minutes or 7, he was not tracking it, Dennis became aware that someone was beside him. He looked up. The man in the gray jacket was watching him with a quality of attention that was neither intrusive nor averted, just present, the way a person looks at someone they have decided to be with. Dennis said, "Sorry." The man said, "Don't be." That was the first thing he said. The second thing was nothing, for a long time. Dennis talked. Not immediately, not fluidly. The way a person talks when the valve has been closed for a long time and the opening of it is not a decision, but a physical fact. Something that happens because the conditions are finally right and there is someone present who has signaled without words that what comes out will be received. He talked about Raymond Culver. He talked about Fallujah in 2004, which was the second deployment, the one that had reconfigured everything, and the specific night in November of that year when Raymond had done something in the dark between two vehicles that Dennis had never described accurately to anyone. Not his ex-wife, not Dr. Whitfield, not his son. The thing that Raymond had done and that Dennis had witnessed, and that had established a debt between them that could not be named or settled, only carried. He talked about the phone call from his son. He talked about not going to Colorado Springs. He talked about Bale's hip and the left side of the bed, and the Sunday calls from Phoenix and Sacramento, and the specific way that ordinary goodness, when it is close to you and reliable, can coexist with a grief so particular and so unshared that the two things do not touch each other. That you can be, simultaneously, a person whose children call on Tuesdays for no reason, and a person who did not drive to Colorado Springs. He talked for a long time. The man beside him listened the way very few people listen, without assembly, without building the response while the words were still arriving, without the visible effort of patience that is itself a kind of distraction. He listened the way the bench received them, steadily, without agenda, as though what was being said had nowhere else it needed to be. Once, after Dennis said something that took a long time to say, and that he had never said before, the man beside him said, "That sounds like the kind of thing that doesn't have anywhere to go." Dennis looked at him. "No," he said, "it doesn't." "That's different from not being real," the man said. "Some things are real and still don't have anywhere to go. That's not a problem you're supposed to solve." Dennis was quiet. "You were there," the man said. "He was there. That happened. That's not going to stop having happened. I know. Colorado Springs was a different thing. That one's still open." Dennis looked at the fountain. "Yes," he said. "When you're ready," the man said, "it'll still be there. The grave, the people who were there, it doesn't close." He said it simply, without counsel, without the structure of advice, which is different from the structure of something true. Dennis looked at him. He had not, in an hour and 40 minutes of talking, looked at the man beside him with anything other than the peripheral attention of someone not ready to make the conversation reciprocal. He looked now. He took in the gray jacket, worn soft at the shoulders, the dark jeans, the quality of stillness in the man's face that was not blankness, but the opposite of blankness. The face of a person who is entirely where they are. "I'm Dennis," he said. The man smiled. The real one. Slightly crooked, unhurried, I know, he said. "Keanu." Dennis was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Bale, who had been asleep against his shin for the past 40 minutes, and who was now lifting his head in the way of a dog that has sensed a shift in the room even without walls. "I don't," he started. "It doesn't matter," the man said. "I would have said things differently." "I don't think you would have," he said. "And I don't think you should." Dennis looked at him. "You knew," he said, not accusing, "something else." "Not until you said your name," he said. "You said it at the beginning. I wasn't sure at first." A pause. It wouldn't have changed anything. Dennis thought about that. He believed it. He believed it because the preceding hour and 40 minutes existed as evidence, and the evidence was complete. "Why did you sit down?" Dennis said. The man thought about it. Not in the way of a person composing an answer, in the way of a person actually looking for one. "I lost someone," he said, "a long time ago. I was in a place that wasn't right for it, and nobody sat down." He looked at the fountain. "I thought about that for years, what it would have been worth." Dennis said nothing. "It's not much," the man said. Sitting down, "It doesn't fix anything." "No," Dennis said. "It's just the thing that was available." They sat for a while after that, not talking. Not in the way of two people who have run out of things to say, but in the way of two people for whom words have done what they were going to do, and what remains is just the morning. Bale stood up slowly, carefully, on the hip that troubled him, and put his head against the man's knee. The man put his hand on the dog's head without looking down, as though this were a thing he had been expecting. At some point, Dennis said, "I should let you go." The man said, "I'm not in a hurry." They stayed another 20 minutes. When they finally stood, the man reached into the inside pocket of the gray jacket and took out a card. It was not a business card. It was a plain white card with a phone number written on it in ink, in a hand that was clean and unhurried. "The friend you lost," he said. "If there's ever a time when you want to talk about him to someone who doesn't know anything about it, who can just listen, call." Dennis looked at the card. He looked at the man. "You mean that?" "I mean it." He put the card in his jacket pocket. They shook hands. The man walked back up the path with the morning still young, in the gray jacket and the dark jeans, and disappeared into the trees the way the light disappears into a room when a door closes. Gradually, then completely, and then only the room. Dennis Marr drove to Colorado Springs 11 days later. He went alone, which was the right way. He drove, which took 11 hours with 2 stops, which was also the right way, because arriving by plane felt too sudden, and he needed the drive to prepare for whatever he was going to find when he got there. He found the grave in the section of the cemetery the family had directed him to, a white marker, standard issue, with the name and the dates and the rank and the 2 campaigns noted below it. He stood there for a long time. He was not sure what he had expected to feel. He felt what he felt, which was something between grief and relief, and the specific quality of presence that comes from being finally in the right place for the right thing, even if the right place and the right thing arrived too late for the timing to be what you would have chosen. He talked to Raymond Culver for about 20 minutes. He said the things he had not said on the phone in 2009, when he had come back from the last deployment and Raymond had called, and Dennis had been not ready to talk about it. And then time had moved the way time moves, and the call had never happened in the way it needed to. He said he was sorry he had not been there 3 weeks ago. He said he understood, now, that not being there was its own piece of the thing he had been carrying, and that he had carried it to the right place, and that he was going to try to put it down here. He did not fully put it down. That was not how it worked, as Dr. Whitfield had told him, and as he had come to understand. What he put down was the part that had been compounding, the weight of the weight, and what was left was simply the grief itself, which was real and appropriate, and which he was learning to carry differently. He stopped at a diner in Pueblo on the way back and ate a burger, and sat for a long time in the booth with a cup of coffee that a waitress refilled twice without being asked. He did not know her name. He thanked her for the coffee. She said it was no trouble. It was the most ordinary exchange imaginable, and it was enough. He drove home. He called the number on the card 8 weeks later. He had thought about calling sooner. He had decided to wait until he had something specific to say, which turned out to be the wrong threshold. But he had not known that until Dr. Whitfield told him, in their December session, that the point of the call was not to have something to say. The call lasted 40 minutes. He talked about Colorado Springs. He talked about the drive and the cemetery and the diner in Pueblo. He talked about what Raymond Culver had been like in the ordinary sense, his laugh, which was too loud for every room he was in, which was something Dennis had spent 22 years being embarrassed by, and which he would now give a great deal to hear once more. He talked about a joke Raymond had told in 2006 in a forward operating base in Ramadi that Dennis had not thought of in years, and that arrived that morning, for no reason he could locate, complete, set up, punchline, Raymond's laugh filling whatever space was available. The man on the other end of the line listened. He asked about the laugh. Dennis described it. "That's a good laugh," the man said. "It was embarrassing," Dennis said. "The best ones are." Dennis was quiet for a moment. "He deserved better," he said. "He deserved you going to Colorado Springs," the man said. "You went. That counts." They talked a little longer. Before they ended the call, Dennis said, "The bench. I don't know if I said thank you. You didn't need to." "I know," Dennis said. "I'm saying it anyway." Dennis Marr still lives in the Silver Lake apartment. Bale's hip is worse in cold weather, which in Los Angeles means the 4 months between December and March, and Dennis has developed the habit of warming a small blanket in the dryer before Bale's morning walk and wrapping it around him for the first 10 minutes, which Bale tolerates with the dignity of a dog who has decided this is simply what mornings are now. He started a support group the following spring, not because someone suggested it, because Dr. Whitfield had said in their February session that the thing that had helped him most, the bench, the listening, the quality of presence that asked nothing back, was not a thing specific to the person who had provided it. It was a practice. It was learnable. It was, in fact, the entire basis of peer support work, which had a 30-year evidence base and which was chronically underfunded at the VA facility in West Los Angeles, which served more than 1,000 veterans in the county and ran its peer support program on 2 part-time coordinators and a waiting list. He volunteered first. He trained for 16 hours over 2 Saturdays. He sat across from 3 men and 2 women in his first month, each of them carrying something that did not have anywhere to go. And he listened the way the bench in Griffith Park had listened, without assembly, without the visible effort of patience, without the structure of advice. He was not always good at it. There were sessions where he talked too much, or where he offered the shape of a solution before the person had finished describing the problem, and Dr. Whitfield, who supervised the volunteers, would note it in the debrief, and he would think about it for 3 days and try to do it differently next time. He got better, slowly, in the way that things get better when the work is real and the person doing it has personal reasons for taking it seriously. By the end of the first year, he was coordinating 2 sessions a week. By the end of the second year, the program had added 3 more volunteers, 2 of whom Dennis had recruited personally, men he had met in his own therapy group who had the quality he was looking for, which he could not entirely name but which he had learned to recognize, the willingness to sit with someone else's weight without trying to lift it prematurely. He described it in a report he wrote for the VA coordinator in his second year. This way, the most useful thing you can do for someone carrying something alone is to make sure they know someone is aware they're carrying it. You don't have to take it from them. You just have to not look away. He did not attribute the sentence to anyone. It was his sentence by then. He goes back to the bench sometimes. Not to find anything, just because the plaza in the morning is still what it was. The fountain, the light through the trees, the particular quiet of a park inside a city that is always making noise just beyond the tree line. He sat there on a Tuesday morning last October, 1 year after the morning that is the center of this story, with Bale moving slowly on the path beside him, and the coffee in the travel mug he had started bringing because the morning warranted it. He sat for about 40 minutes. Nobody joined him. Nobody needed to. He looked at the bench beside him for a while. Then, he looked at the fountain. Then he finished his coffee and walked Bale home in the morning light. I have been sitting with this story for a long time. It is the simplest one I know how to tell. A bench. 2 men. 2 hours. Nothing that could be photographed or verified or quantified in any way that matters. What I keep returning to is the moment before the sitting down. The moment when you register that someone next to you is in pain. And you make the calculation, barely a calculation, more like a reflex of whether this is your business, whether you are the right person, whether the gap between where you are and where they are can or should be crossed. Most of us, most of the time, find a reason that it cannot. We are not equipped. We do not want to intrude. We have somewhere to be, or we tell ourselves we do. We look at our phone. We shift slightly away. We make the space that is already between strangers on a public bench into something larger and more formal, and we let it stand. He did not do that. He did not ask if it was his business. He turned slightly and said nothing and stayed. For 2 hours, on a Tuesday morning in October, with nowhere he had to be until later. I don't know how to become a person who does that without thinking. I would like to be that person. I'm not sure I am. But I know what it costs, which is 2 hours and the willingness to be with something you cannot fix. And I know what it returns, not to the person sitting down, but to the person already there. And the accounting, when I run it, does not seem close. The bench is always available. The question is only whether you sit. This story is fictional, inspired by Keanu Reeves' well-known reputation for the kind of presence that asks nothing back and costs more than it appears to. If something in this one stayed with you, drop a comment and tell me what you took from it. Share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. See you in the next one.